Now, Broca examined, lots of these patients, and all the patients that he actually saw actually had suffered damage in the left frontal lobe. And all the patients that he saw also happened to be right-handed patients. And it turns out, with modern imaging techniques, we know a little bit more about the involvement of the left frontal lobe in sort of production deficits with people who have aphasias that are similar to Broca's, for example. They tend to be either right-handed or a majority of left-handers. So probably about 80% of left-handers seem to have a similar organization for the language production network on the in the left hemisphere of the brain. But about 20% of left-handers have a kind of an interesting, like distribution of language network of areas that are associated with the language network. So it's not as clear exactly how their language networks are organized. This typically ends up leaving them out of studies that examine, the relationship of the brain to the behavior of language, because you don't want somebody who's going to be an outlier and mess up the nice statistical power of your experiment. So, but in general, what we're talking about in terms of the organization of these networks is limited to a majority of left-handers and pretty much all right-handers, as we can tell. Many of Broca's patients also experienced what he called a right side, so right side of the body, hemi, that means half the body, so the right half of the body, paresis. And a paresis is a weakness. And it turns out, if you remember our discussion of how the brain is organized, remember the frontal lobe is really critical for motor function. The sort of motor aspects of any kind of complex behavior, including language. So we're going to see that speech, sign, writing, the expression of language, of what you're trying to say, actually is dependent upon networks in the frontal lobe. In particular, for most of us, the left hemisphere frontal lobe, this area called Broca's area, over in this region, just a little bit, back from Broca's area is this kind of strip we talked about. This is called the motor strip. Remember the body, the motor output to the opposite side of the body is kind of mapped on this motor strip. This is called primary motor cortex, or M1, it's sometimes referred to as. So oftentimes when people have a Broca's aphasia in the left hemisphere, they have damage, right? The damage may extend posteriorly into this region back here and damage some of that output, to the opposite half of the body. So they end up with this weakness, many Broca's aphasics do, on the opposite side of their body, what they call a hemiparesis, a right hemiparesis, since the damage that led to the loss of language function was in the left hemisphere.